Today I'm ranking the top 10 Super Bowl quarterbacks in history. We're almost at 60 Super Bowls. Who are the greatest quarterbacks in Super Bowl history? And that's how quarterbacks are judged. To be the greatest quarterbacks, you have to do it on the greatest stage with the highest stakes. That's why we have these debates about who are the greatest quarterbacks. You can be a top 10 quarterback of all time without necessarily being a great Super Bowl quarterback. But if you're in the discussion, a very select group ever as the very greatest, top 3 quarterbacks, you got to do it in the Super Bowl. So let's start off by this with what's the criteria here? Who does not qualify for these top 10 quarterback rankings in Super Bowl history? It would be players who only had one great game or one appearance. As great as some of them were, such as Phil Simms with the 86 Giants, or Steve Young with the 94 49ers, Drew Brees with the 09 Saints. You have to have played in more than one Super Bowl. So they're not on my list. And you know what's also amazing about the all-time great Super Bowl quarterbacks? If we did the opposite list, if we said who are the 10 worst, or even more interesting in some ways, the 5 worst Super Bowl quarterbacks, you'd see some great names on that list. Hall of Famers fill the list, meaning a lot of quarterbacks all-time great quarterbacks don't do well under pressure. But let's begin. One honorable mention, Kurt Warner, who had a losing record in Super Bowls. He had 1 win, 2 losses in the Super Bowl, but he had great numbers in all 3. He performed quite well in all 3 Super Bowls. And you have to look at it in the context. Where was this in history? He won an MVP in that 99 season, in the regular season, but he also won the Super Bowl MVP. He was the first quarterback ever to throw for 400 yards in a Super Bowl. One of the reasons why he didn't quite make my top 10, it wasn't so much because he had a losing record, it's because of the weapons. And I'm not going to fault these great quarterbacks for having great weapons, because usually you have to have some big-time players around you if you're going to be considered among the best. And you're going to see that throughout this list. There are Hall of Famers on these offenses. Kurt Warner on that 99 Rams team, the 01 Rams team, he had Isaac Bruce, Marshall Faulk, Torrey Holt. In my opinion, all 3 belong in the Hall of Fame. The greatest show on turf. And then with the Cardinals in 08, he had Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden. I mean, that was also one of the most underrated receiving duos in history. But when you think of the Rams, imagine if you put them in today's NFL. Could they be stopped? The greatest show on turf? When you can't hit the quarterback, when you can't be physical, when you can't hit the receivers either. I mean, that was the formula for beating the Rams team. That was the only way you could beat those Rams teams, by being physical, hitting Kurt Warner, making him uncomfortable, and then making those receivers uncomfortable, getting physical with them. And then you take away the threat of what defenses could do back then, and you put them in today's game. I don't know how you'd stop the Rams, to be honest. They could be unstoppable in the modern rules with that much speed. And the thing was about Kurt Warner, if you get him a clean pocket, he'd carve you up with the best of them. Not mobile, but give him time and a clean pocket, look out. Okay, let's officially start this. Number 10, Brett Favre. And a lot of people have had fun with Brett Favre, and Brett Favre's come under a lot of criticism, and there's been a lot of jokes about Brett Favre. He threw a lot of interceptions. Obviously, he has the most interceptions thrown in the history of the game. He turned the football over. He was a gunslinger. But Brett Favre was fun. Brett Favre was entertaining. Brett Favre was a joy to watch. And when you look at him in the Super Bowls, he wasn't perfect, but he played great actually in both Super Bowls. It's very surprising. In that 96 Super Bowl against the Patriots, he did not get MVP honors. He didn't exactly light it up, but he had a big-time game. I mean, you think of the long TD passes he had to both Freeman and Risen. Historically speaking, that would have been enough to win MVP. Threw for over 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. He didn't actually turn the football over. He threw for 2 touchdowns. He ran for a touchdown. I mean, even if he'd thrown an interception and they won, you would have thought he would have won MVP. But no MVP for Brett Favre. It went to Desmond Howard. So 3 total touchdowns, 2 passing, 1 rushing. He didn't get the MVP. He makes it back the next season as the Packers were going for a repeat, and it was against the Denver Broncos. Favre versus Elway. And Brett Favre outplayed John Elway in that Super Bowl. I mean, there's no question about it. He was better. He had 3 touchdowns, 1 pick. Said he did get intercepted, but he made bigger plays than Elway. Elway had a gutty performance. We all think about the helicopter. But the hero of that game offensively was Terrell Davis. And again, I'm not here to criticize John Elway. John Elway is a top 10 quarterback of all time. But Brett Favre was better in that Super Bowl. And if you want to look at the career of Brett Favre, though, who were the great Hall of Famers around Brett Favre in his career? When you think of, he had a 3-peat winning the MVP. He won 3 consecutive MVPs. He absolutely put up incredible numbers in the 90s, Brett Favre. And who was he doing it with? Good players. Yes, good players. He had Freeman. He had Risen for that season. But he never had a Hall of Fame running back. I mean, the best running back he had was Mon Green. And then when he was in the Super Bowl, Sterling Sharp's career was over. Sterling Sharp, I would argue, is probably the best player Brett Favre had as a receiver or as a weapon. But with all the jokes and the criticisms, and yes, we remember the interception, the championship game in 2009 against the Saints, Brett Favre was pretty darn good in the Super Bowls. That's number 10. Number 9 for me is Jim Plunkett. Now, Jim Plunkett was the first overall pick by the New England Patriots, and he never lived up to expectations with New England. But he found success in his career with the Raiders. He never made it to a Pro Bowl, but great postseason success, and he got it done in the Super Bowl. 2 Super Bowl appearances, 2-0 in the Super Bowl from Jim Plunkett, including an MVP in his first Super Bowl. He played the Eagles, he played the Redskins. And the Redskins, let's not forget, that second Super Bowl for Plunkett's Raiders, if we're going to call it Plunkett's Raiders, the Redskins were defending champions. They were attempting to repeat. And he's best known for having a big game in the first Super Bowl against the Eagles, the 1980 Super Bowl. But Plunkett really silenced critics with these 2 Super Bowls. They weren't the greatest performances, but you look at his stats, 4 touchdowns, no picks in 2 Super Bowls. I mean, he got it done. The second Super Bowl, we think more against the Redskins of Marcus Allen, but it was a very solid performance from Jim Plunkett. And I don't think he's a Hall of Fame player, but he was a great Super Bowl quarterback. And he helped the Raiders get their 2nd and 3rd Super Bowls. And the Raiders, also the butt of many people's jokes now, have a very significant place in NFL history. Number 8, Eli Manning. Now, I don't think of Eli Manning quite as highly as others do. If you asked me, should Eli Manning belong in the Hall of Fame? I'm strong about this, and I say no. Eli Manning, if you just mean, oh, he's well known, he's a Manning, if you just mean Hall of Fame is in terms of being famous, and you let him in that way, well, I suppose you'd let him in. But the Hall of Fame is supposed to really be about the best players, and Eli never for a moment was considered a top 5 quarterback in this league. He was never in the discussion among the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but what everyone always thinks about are these Super Bowls. And I do feel when you look at Eli's Super Bowls and the Super Bowl runs he had, a lot of the breaks went the Giants' ways. I mean, you could call it luck, you could call it breaks. The Giants had them in playoff games. They had him in Super Bowls. The David Tyree catch, the helmet catch, that ball could have been intercepted. I mean, it was a miracle play. Eli did not have a great game. I would argue his 2nd Super Bowl was much better actually than the first. I mean, the Manningham catch down the sideline, that is one of the greatest throws in Super Bowl history. What I will say about Eli, though, he could take hits. He could take a pretty good beating. He would stay in that pocket. He would commit to a throw. Eli's tough. And where he gets credit is he went up against Tom Brady both times. Tom Brady, still the greatest quarterback in NFL history, regardless of what happens on Sunday. If Patrick Mahomes wins 3 straight, Tom Brady's still the greatest. Let's have the conversation when Mahomes has at least 5. But Eli took Brady down twice. He got the better of him 2 times in Super Bowls. And he's 2-0, and he was the better Manning in the Super Bowl. No debate. Peyton's the best of the Manning quarterbacks. But when it came to the Super Bowl, Eli was better than Peyton. Number 7, Bart Starr. He played in the first 2 Super Bowls. I mean, the Packers were already a dominant force. They had won NFL championships, and they played in the first 2 Super Bowls under Vince Lombardi, and Bart Starr was their quarterback. And Bart Starr won the first 2 Super Bowls, and he won the MVP award in both Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II. He's so much of the reason why the Packers are so important to this day was because of Bart Starr. Super Bowl I, though, the most famous play in Super Bowl I was actually a bad throw by Bart Starr. It's probably a ball that could have been intercepted. The Max McGee one-handed catch. Max McGee could have been the MVP. And the numbers aren't going to impress you so much, but again, think about where this was in history. This was the mid-'60s. And Bart Starr threw in his 2 Super Bowls 3 touchdowns and 1 interception. Those are actually good numbers for that time. They're not going to blow you away today. But a lot of interceptions were thrown in that era because defenses were allowed to play defense. And he went up against two good defenses. I mean, you think about the Chiefs. You know how many Hall of Fame players were on that Super Bowl I Chiefs team? Bobby Bell, Willie Lanier. I mean, do your research of how many Hall of Fame players played in Super Bowl I on the Chiefs defense. And then the Raiders were also an excellent team in Super Bowl II. So Bart Starr belongs on here, and he deserves some respect here at number 7. Number 6, Roger Staubach. He played in 4 Super Bowls. He had a 2-2 record, 8 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and 1 Super Bowl MVP. His first Super Bowl was a win against the Dolphins. And that was the Dolphins, Don Shula's Dolphins, Bob Greasy's team. That was the team that went to 3 straight Super Bowls. That was the team the next season that would go undefeated and then would repeat. Well, before those 2 seasons, they were in the Super Bowl also, and they were defeated by the Dallas Cowboys. In just an efficient, solid performance out of him. His second Super Bowl, though, would be different. It would be a defeat to the Pittsburgh Steelers at the peak of the Pittsburgh Steel curtain defense, that team. His third Super Bowl would be a victory against the Denver Broncos. And then last Super Bowl was a rematch against the Steelers where he performed very well but lost. I mean, Roger Staubach, though he's 2-2 in the Super Bowl, was extremely impressive because his 2 losses came against the Steelers of the 70s. They said that first Steelers team, I mean, that was just one of the great defenses. And they were still loaded, not quite as good at the end of the 70s, but still loaded. And those are the teams he lost to. And Roger Staubach, to me, if you brought him in the modern game, would be so good. Because he could make the throws, and he was an underrated athlete. He was athletic. He could move. He could run some. And he displayed a lot of talent in those Super Bowls. And he's still the greatest Cowboys quarterback of all time. With all due respect to Troy Aikman and all the attention the quarterbacks have received who shouldn't get the attention they get nowadays just because they're Cowboys, Staubach's the best. Number 5. Well, I'd go with another Cowboys quarterback, and that would be Troy Aikman. Now, this is where Troy Aikman beats out Roger Staubach because Aikman still has one of the all-time great single performances in Super Bowl history. And that was his first Super Bowl, the 92 season. 4 touchdown passes he threw in the Cowboys demolishing the Buffalo Bills. And Troy Aikman is not considered one of the all-time great quarterbacks. He has his place in the Hall of Fame. But people look around and say, well, look at the team he had. He had, for the time, a massive offensive line protecting him. He could hand the ball off to Emmitt Smith. There was Daryl Johnston, who was a Pro Bowl fullback. He had Michael Irvin, Jay Novacek, Alvin Harper. I mean, just look at all the talent on the Cowboys offense. It's sort of the same way Emmitt Smith doesn't get as much credit as perhaps he should receive because everyone just says, well, it's the offensive line. For him, well, when it's Troy Aikman, well, he had Emmitt Smith. But they came together, and this was one of the great all-time teams, and Aikman left his mark in an unforgettable game, one of the greatest Super Bowl performances by a quarterback, carving up the Buffalo Bills. His other two Super Bowls were not quite as impressive, but they were good performances. So altogether, his statistics in the Super Bowl were 5 touchdowns and 1 interception. He had 1 MVP, most importantly, 3-0. He avoided the mistakes. He could make the big plays, but he avoided the mistakes, the turnovers. And he's still, again, widely considered one of the greatest quarterbacks in Super Bowl history. And the time he retired, he was top 3. For sure, he was a top 3 Super Bowl quarterback when he hung it up. It was a relatively short career from Aikman because of injury, but it was a great career if you're measuring it by success. 3 Super Bowls. He was one of the closest to getting the three-peat, at least make it to the conference championship game 4 times in a row, and he was a great big game quarterback. Troy Aikman, taking down the Bills twice, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, now you're really looking at the Final Four. With the Final Four, this is where it really got more difficult. In number 4, I'm going to go with Patrick Mahomes. Others would have him higher, but when I look at Patrick Mahomes and the era he's played in, it's the age of the quarterback, protecting the quarterback, protecting the receivers, where everything is in favor of the offense. His Super Bowl performances have been good, but I would argue that none of them have really been great. He's had great moments, and when the pressure's on, at the end of close games, he's been as good as anybody. Whether that's his first Super Bowl coming back down 10 in the fourth quarter. Brilliant. Second Super Bowl victory against the Eagles, the second half especially. You think about that run. Or this past Super Bowl overtime victory, how good he was in the fourth quarter and overtime to defeat the 49ers for a second time. He has 3 MVPs. He's 3-1. And that one Super Bowl, as Chiefs fans will remind me, he had a banged-up offensive line. He had to run for his life. He didn't have time to pass. And I hear you on that. But can we also say he didn't have the greatest of games either? You can't have, you can't be number 1 or number 2 on this list. Hear me out. You can't be number 1 or 2 on this list if you were held to single digits. And he was held to single digits. He against the Buccaneers, now we're not going to dwell on this, but it has to be said why he's not in the top 3. He was held to 9 points. He had multiple turnovers, held to 9 points, and it was kind of a blowout. It wasn't a competitive game. And even in the victories, you just look at his overall statistics. Yes, the 3 MVPs are amazing, but 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He hasn't had one of his all-time great games. He hasn't, again, just dominated from start to finish in any of these Super Bowls. I mean, he was held down in this last 2023 Super Bowl until late in the game. Second half, I mean, the first half, he didn't do much. But one thing I really want to compliment Mahomes on is this. When the pressure's on, when his opponents tighten up, he plays his best. And then the other thing I will certainly give to Patrick Mahomes is, compared to some of these other quarterbacks on the list, the quality of opponents. Okay, quality of opponents that he played. The quarterback's not necessarily always the best. Garoppolo, I watched all Jimmy Garoppolo's games as a 49ers fan, and he had his moments, but often it was rough with Garoppolo, and he would throw some of the worst interceptions. Jalen Hurts, good quarterback, not a great quarterback. I mean, going back to Garoppolo, he never was a Pro Bowler, not once. He was very inconsistent. Hurts is a good quarterback, not a great quarterback. Brock Purdy had a great season last season. It's early in his career. We need to see more from Brock Purdy. Not Hall of Fame quarterbacks here. Not the toughest quarterbacks that he faced. But I will say that the defenses that he played were above average defenses. 49ers in 2019, that was an excellent defense. The Buccaneers, that was a good defense. I don't think it's quite on the level of these other ones that he played, but that was just a very balanced and well-coached team. The 2022 Eagles also, that was a good defense. And then 2023 49ers was also what I would consider an above-average defense. Not as good as the 2019 team, but an above-average defense. Number 3, Terry Bradshaw. People may laugh at him today, sort of like, the jokes and the humor about Brett Favre, and because it's been so long since Bradshaw's played. He played in the 70s, he played into the early 80s. But he was called the Blonde Bomber for a reason. He was the Blonde Bomber before he was on Fox NFL Sunday, on their panel, on the pre and the post game show. Terry Bradshaw was the first quarterback to win not only 3 Super Bowls, but 4 Super Bowls. In fairness, on the other side of the field was the Steel Curtain defense. Was players, all-time great players, like Joe Green and Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Mel Blount. His center was Mike Webster, probably the second greatest center in NFL history. He had Franco Harris to hand the ball off to. There was Lynn Swann, there was John Stallworth. These are just Hall of Famers all over the place. Steelers had some of the greatest teams to ever play. They were really the first true dynasty in the Super Bowl era. But Terry Bradshaw was the first quarterback to win 3. He was also the first quarterback to win 4. And with him as quarterback, the Steelers were undefeated in their Super Bowls. 4-0. 4-0. And you need to go back and watch the Super Bowls, especially those ones against the Cowboys, where, yes, there were some turnovers in these Super Bowls, but this was the 70s. This is when you could play defense, when defenders actually had a right to the football. He had a cannon arm. He could go deep vertical football with accuracy. And what I like to point out about Terry Bradshaw is he was also, yes, in the privileged position to be surrounded by such talent. But he was the first quarterback in Super Bowl history to throw for 300 yards. Staubach didn't do it. Tarkenton didn't do it. Just thinking of the other Hall of Fame quarterbacks from that era, they didn't do it. Stabler didn't do it. It was Bradshaw. And he did it twice. He did it consecutively in his last 2 Super Bowls. And if you know a little bit about the Steelers, they had to lean on the offense a little bit more in the late 70s. They weren't as strong defensively, and Terry Bradshaw stepped it up. And he had some of these huge performances. I mean, you just didn't see 300-yard passing games back there in that era. It was rare. And he did it twice in his 2 final Super Bowls, and his overall Super Bowl numbers are excellent. 9 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. I'm just comparing that to Mahomes in the quarterback era, the quarterback-friendly era, 7 touchdowns, 5 picks. Touchdown-interception ratios don't tell the whole story, but it still remains a good marker. And he won 2 MVPs. Again, you just think about all the great Hall of Famers on each side of the football. Well, he won half the MVPs of those Steelers Super Bowls. Number 2, Tom Brady, who played in a record 10 Super Bowls. Yes, 10 Super Bowls. And he went 7-3 in those Super Bowls. And I know Patrick Mahomes has been on a great run, but I'd be surprised if Patrick Mahomes gets to 9 or 10 Super Bowls. He's already in his 5th in what would be considered his age 29 season. But what Tom Brady did by getting to Super Bowls in 01, 03, 04, 07, 11, 14, 16, 17, 18, and 20. I mean, you want to talk about a memorable career. The fact that I can remember those dates and the fact that he did get to 3. It's not just winning 3 out of 4 from 01 to 04. But think about this. He got to 3 straight Super Bowls at age 39, 40, and 41. That's crazy. And then his final Super Bowl was at age 43. Age 43, he won his last Super Bowl. I just don't imagine we're going to see that again. We might, but that is the standard as far as Super Bowl appearances. He went 7-3 in those Super Bowls. So why is he not number 1? Because he has, in those 7 Super Bowl victories, he's got 5 MVPs. 6 MVPs. It's because he didn't always have the greatest of games. I mean, he had a very much of a game manager win in his first Super Bowl. He was young. That's understandable. But he didn't lose the game, and he did drive his team down to get the game-winning field goal. His next 2 Super Bowls were very impressive performances. The disappointment, though, was those 2 losses to the Giants, where it was a bit underwhelming. It was not up to the Brady standard twice in a row. You could give him a bad game, and you know what? When you play in that many Super Bowls, you're not going to have 10 great Super Bowls. You're not, right? You're going to have an off day. That's part of being human, even for Tom Brady. But to those back-to-back Super Bowls, to Eli Manning, who, and with all due respect to those Giants teams, they were very well coached, and I still feel like they had a lot of breaks. He lost to Eli Manning twice. It wasn't an all-time great on the other side of the field, and he lost to the Giants. They had good players. on offense. They had good players on defense. But how many of those players were Hall of Fame players? I mean, who are they? And he lost twice to them. Not all his fault, but which one was worse? Well, I mean, they only managed 14 points against the New York Giants. That was the 07 Patriots. The team that was undefeated was unable to finish the season off. That was somewhat embarrassing for the Patriots and Tom Brady, and the whole team for that matter. Not being able to close it out. And I know what that's like as a Warriors fan, and not being able to close it out against the Cavs, being up 3-1. It's a black spot on the career and for the season. But then I will say his next Super Bowl against the Seahawks was one of the bright spots. Considering that defense, they weren't as good as they were, Pete Carroll's Legion of Boom defense, as they were the year before. They weren't quite as healthy either. But Brady just wouldn't give up in that game. He threw a couple picks, but he had just against that caliber of defense, he had a sensational game. And you could easily argue he should have never won that game, because all the Seahawks had to do was just run the football. That's all they had to do with Marshawn Lynch. And believe me, I'm with you. I was as stunned as everybody else that the Seahawks were throwing the ball, not running the ball at the goal line. But then you could play that same game with the Giants Super Bowl. At least the first one. David Tyree should have never had any business making that catch. And they should have probably said Eli Manning was sacked before he even got to throw that ball. Again, we could play that game with a lot of these Super Bowls. But you have that Super Bowl. You have the 28-3 comeback Super Bowl. They did lose to the Eagles the following year after the Falcons, but he'd come back and win again at age 41 against the Rams, though it was not an impressive Super Bowl. But one of his most impressive Super Bowls was his final one. And who did he beat? Patrick Mahomes. And it was just a strong game from start to finish. And you really couldn't finish any better than that. And that Super Bowl run by Brady was, just think about who he had to go through to get that Super Bowl in Tampa Bay. Had to beat Breeze, though Breeze was clearly at the end of his career. Still had to go to New Orleans and beat Drew Brees in Green Bay against Aaron Rodgers. I mean, Aaron Rodgers, I don't care what people say, he is one of the best. Easily a top 10 quarterback of all time. And then he had to defeat Patrick Mahomes. Again, you could always make excuses saying, well, Mahomes didn't have the healthiest of teams. Okay. But his team just about blew out Patrick Mahomes' team. And whatever happens with Mahomes' career from here on out, he's never going to be able to say, well, I beat Brady in the Super Bowl. Brady's always going to have that on Mahomes. So in total, 21 touchdowns and 6 interceptions in the career of Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. I compare that to Mahomes right now. If they're the closest to being contemporaries. 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, 21-6. Yeah, it's not all about TDs and interceptions. But 10 Super Bowls. 10 Super Bowls. From 2001 to 2020. All those teams he faced. But with all that said, as long as we've gone on about Tom Brady, you could just do a separate episode about Tom Brady. Number one, in the Super Bowl, is still Joe Montana. He's still the gold standard. He played in 4 Super Bowls. He won 4 Super Bowls. He won 3 MVPs, 11 touchdowns, no interceptions. He outshined Dan Marino. He outshined John Elway. He did it with Jerry Rice. He did it without Jerry Rice. The first game, the first Super Bowl, the 81 one, was more of very similar to Brady's. Managed the team, didn't make the mistakes, got the job done. Then the next Super Bowl was a huge Super Bowl. 300 plus yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks against the Dolphins. Then the 88 one. That was more Jerry Rice's big game, but still a great game from Montana. Not at his very best, but still, like, what are we saying? A B plus A minus game out of Joe Montana, and he leads them down the field and throws the perfect touchdown pass to John Taylor. That's 3. And then number 4, to complete the 49ers Super Bowls of the 80s, to win 4 and to clearly be the team of the 80s, to be the second team to win 4. And Joe was the first to win 3 MVPs, a 5-touchdown performance. No, he never threw for 400 yards or even 500 yards in a Super Bowl like Tom Brady, but this was the 80s. 5 touchdowns. He became the first Super Bowl quarterback to throw 5 touchdowns. It's only been matched by his successor, Steve Young, who threw 6 in '94. But 5 touchdown passes. And I need to say this for those who lose track of time and history. This was the 80s. This was a decade that had great defensive teams. In the NFC, this was the decade, and this was some of the reason why the 49ers didn't always get in either. This was the decade that had the 85 Bears. This was the decade that had the 86 Giants. And if Montana didn't get injured, it's always one of the big ifs, he likely would have had 5 Super Bowls. They held on to beat the Giants. I have great confidence they would have beat the Bills. And Montana probably would have had another MVP. But Montana has been eclipsed by Brady as the greatest quarterback of all time. And he may be surpassed by Mahomes as well for all-time rankings. But as far as the Super Bowl is concerned, he's still the best. Case closed. Joe Montana, the greatest Super Bowl quarterback of all time.